Right to speak today. So as I was sort of listening to Diane, I was hoping I haven't made that error of being a technical expert and talking too much about the economic side when tomorrow we'll have a focus on the economic side. But I have to say, I'm sort of fascinated with the challenges we face in what we can think of as the AI value chain. So I'm going to try and come at that from a technical perspective, hinting at ideas from economics and business where relevant. But before I get too deeply into how I see that challenge, which is mainly from my perspective focused on the notion of what I think of as information flows, I want to sort of just give you my notion of what I think one of the biggest problems we face around the AI debate today, which is the notion of artificial general intelligence. And this is my one slide attempt to sort of explain why that's a ridiculous idea. The notion of artificial general intelligence for me is akin to the notion of what we might think of as an artificial general vehicle. So I don't know how many of you were fans as youngsters of the Wacky Races. I was a great fan, Hanna-Barbera cartoon. And this is a re-rendering of the marvelous invention of Professor Pat Pending's vehicle, which was a vehicle that had these different characteristics. It could fly. I think in the Wacky Races, he had a helicopter portion. And I asked Dan Andrews, who does graphical scribe work for us, to render a notion of an artificial general vehicle. So the idea of the artificial general vehicle is the vehicle you can use in all circumstances. So I use it to get from home to St. Catherine's College this morning. I use it to get to Hong Kong when I need to go there at the end of the month, and I use it to get down to London. So it has all the characteristics that I might need, like my cycle pedaling. It's got the wings, it's got jet engines, it's even got an Elon Musk-like starship on the top of it. And of course, it's a total and amusing absurdity. By the way, I checked, Pat Pending only won the Wacky Races twice in the series as it went back in the 1970s. Because although there are sort of general principles underlying vehicles, and it's got a little Formula One front, so things like aerodynamics and friction that we can think can combine together, the actual application of a vehicle is dependent on context. And as is true for vehicles, so is true for our intelligence. So there are general principles underlying intelligence, including, for example, how we handle uncertainties. But how we combine those principles together are contextual. So the notion of a sort of dominant intelligence, an intelligence that can outperform all intelligences, is as absurd and ridiculous as the notion of a dominant vehicle. Now, if I give you a context, if I say, well, we're going to get from London to New York and we'd like to get there in the least time, then we can start giving answers. We can say, well, some kind of jet plane might be the best approach. But if I don't give you that context, and if I don't give you the criteria, it might not be time, it might be energy, we can't answer the question, what is best? It doesn't mean we can't measure, that we can't look in particular contexts, but the overall notion of a dominant intelligence is a total absurdity. And the fact that it's dominating the conversation in this field is more to do with marketing and the sort of people whose obsession with science fiction is dominating our conversation. But having said that, there are things we can talk about and quantify. And my focus tends to be on the sort of things we can quantify. And one of those is information. And the key aspect that I want to focus on that I talk about in the book, Atomic Human, is the nature of our intelligence and its context, because that says so much about who we are and what we do. And the idea is that we have a locked-in intelligence. So what do I mean by that? Well, in the book, I use the analogy of the book, well, and the film, the story of Jean-Dominique Bauby, who was the French editor of Elle magazine, who suffered a brainstem stroke, and that limited his ability to communicate. So he actually wrote a book about the experience, and he wrote the book by winking. And so he winked as his assistant, as is shown here, pointed at certain letters to write a book that it took him, I think, 10 months of 4 hours a day. So he was writing at a rate of about 1 word every 2 minutes. Now, the interesting thing about that is we can sort of measure his rate of information transfer. Because while we can't measure intelligence in the way that people would have you think, in fact, the idea we can measure it goes back to Francis Galton. It's totally associated with eugenics and a book called Hereditary Genius. But we can't measure intelligence like we can measure height, which was Francis Galton's conception. But we can measure information. So what we do if we look at information, Claude Shannon told us how to quantify information, or he came up with a theory that allows us to quantify information. And that theory relies on the notion of the bit. So one bit of information is how much information you gain from me if I share with you the result of a 50-50 outcome. So if I toss a coin and tell you the answer is heads, you gain one bit of information. But similarly, if I say to you, Federer has beaten Nadal, and beforehand we thought it was about 50-50 odds that Federer was going to win, I've also shared with you one bit of information. Now, that idea of information is the sort of foundation of the modern digital society. It's pervasive in computer science. But the interesting thing is there's a big disparity between our ability to share information and the machines. So Claude Shannon, who developed information theory, also estimated the information in a word, and he estimated that each word contains about 12 bits of information. So that means that Jean-Dominique Bauby, when he's communicating, is communicating at about 6 bits of information per minute. Now, I'm going a lot faster than that. I'm going at about 2,000 bits per minute if I'm speaking at a good word per minute public speaking rate. So I'm going 300 times faster than Bauby. So what do I mean that human intelligence is locked in? The locked in state of Bauby, he had a brainstem stroke, he couldn't communicate, is the fact that he could think, but he couldn't communicate. But we're going 300 times faster. But the important comparison we need to make is that between us and the machine. Now, because machines communicate with other machines using electromagnetic radiation to communicate, and electromagnetic radiation travels about 1 million times faster than sound, they automatically have a factor of 1 million advantage just from the physics. And when you look at actual communication rates, what you see is that machines actually communicate around about 600 billion bits per minute. So what does that mean? That means that the machine goes 300 million times faster than us. Now, to give you a sense of that, if Bauby's traveling 6 bits per minute at walking pace, let's think of that as 1 meter per second. So about that pace, get back to the microphone. So he's going at 1 meters per second. We're going 300 times faster. So us compared to Bauby is the difference between us and speed of sound, or us and a very fast jet plane. But if we compare us and the machine, the difference between us and the machine is a factor of 300 million. That's the difference between us and the speed of light, walking pace and the speed of light, 300 million. That's where the big difference is. So all this rubbish you're hearing about orders of magnitude greater intelligence, it's nonsensical. It can't be measured in any physically meaningful way. But the rate of transfer of information, the machine is 8 orders of magnitude faster. So when you're comparing intelligences, and the word intelligence is valid, we have a sense of what intelligence might mean as humans. It's harder to define in a sort of quantified physics way, but we have a sense of it. When we're comparing intelligences between us and machines, you have to remember that we're comparing utterly different contexts. You're comparing an entity that is in fact traveling at the speed of light versus us that's walking around. You would never talk about a race between those two entities. And how you would talk about those entities wielding that information budget is actually what we might think of as the intelligence underpinning it. So I just want to sort of be clear, it's utterly meaningless to compare intelligences in that way because our context is totally different. But it's highly meaningful to look at these information flows because these information flows are quantifiable. In fact, they're very fundamental even in physics itself. So what we're really looking at is a changing rate, the flow of information. And to give you a sort of another sense of these types of information flows and what they mean, another analogy I sometimes think of is you can look at the information flow that's occurring genetically on our ecology, the information flow across generations. And if we look at how much information humans are sharing with the next generation through reproduction, we can see that that flow of information is about 1 billion times slower than the rate of information I'm sharing with you now. Whereas the machine, it's not quite 1 billion, but it's up there near 1 billion times faster. So to give you a sense of what's going on, the machine watching me speak to you now is roughly equivalent to us watching a plant evolve in terms of information flow rates, roughly equivalent. Now, it doesn't mean plants aren't evolving. In fact, when we look at the planet and the complexity around us, what we see is an immense amount of complexity from systems that have shared information across time, across billions of years, at highly parallel, through highly parallel mechanisms. It's going on all over the place. So the amount of information moving forward is quite a lot, right? And there you see vast complexity and interaction in our ecology. Similarly, while we're much slower than the machine, our culture, if you look at human history over time, the complexity of our interactions with each other means there's another layer of our intelligence, which is our sort of cultural intelligence, our democratic institutions at the moment that have been with us, evolving for around about 200 years. And that complexity is much greater than us than it is the machine. So what we see, and my plot is not going to quite capture this. Oh, I don't seem to be moving forward anymore. We do next slide. There we go. Oh, lots of next slides all in one go. So what we see is a plot like this, that when it comes to bandwidth, the machine is much faster than human beings. But when it comes to complexity, and my initial plot, this is supposed to be animated, but the animation's already run through, the complexity is high on the side of the planet, but the propagation of information is very low. So when you see the effect of these information things on society, what we see is these changing flows of information have the following effect, that the fast information propagation that we have as human beings can actually undermine the complexity of our ecology. So if you think 200 years ago, when James Watt and Matthew Boulton are developing the steam engine, they're not worrying about the effect of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, right? Because from their perspective, the thing they do worry about is the boiler exploding. So Watt was very against high pressure steam, which made his engines less efficient, because he was worried about it on safety grounds. So it wasn't that these people weren't worried about the effect of their technology. It's just they couldn't conceive of what would happen across 200 years, which, from our perspective, 200 years is a long time. But from the perspective of the planet, it's a blink of an eye. And that's the same type of effect we receive from the machine. So as we go for more automated decision making, which I think is a better term for AI, so what we're seeing is actually algorithmic decision making on the back of this information. And that information, those decisions are taking place very rapidly. Those decisions don't understand our wider context. So when you want to understand the way that this technology has an effect on us, it's better, I think, understood in terms of the way that we have an effect on our climate and our ecology. So we do things across generations. You just have to look outside planes at what we've done to our landscape and sort of wonder about what effect that has on our ecology, on the insects, on the birds, on the wildlife around us, right? And we know a very big one. We're suffering mass extinctions, at the sort of scale of as if a meteorite had attacked us. But we don't perceive that on our timescales. And that's the same challenge we face from the machine, that the machine is making decisions that much more rapidly without understanding our wider cultural context. And the nature of those decisions can have a significant effect that undermine aspects of our culture. And that's, of course, occurring, within our lifetimes. Within the last 15 years, we see the erosion of our democratic institutions. We see the undermining of our culture that has sustained us in ways that, are definitely quite problematic. So how do I think about that? Well, I often, I don't know, is there just a delay on it, or is it, we go to the next, do two forward, that one. If we look at the new flow of information, then what we can see that in the past, we had this relationship with data that I like to represent with this sort of very narrow arrow. And the notion of this relationship is the sort of days of classical statistics. So next slide, please. And when we had classical statistics, we introduced that to stop us misinterpreting information. So if you go back to the sort of era of the, quote, lies, damn lies, and statistics, you find an era when people were misrepresenting the world through statistical facts. And the reason they could do that is because one of the approaches we take to dealing with our low bandwidth information is we overinterpret the information we get. And normally that's okay because we interact with that information. So I might make an assumption about whether the microphone's on or not, and then I can actually go, and check, yes, the microphone's on. I can intervene in my world. But one of the challenges with statistics is it's non-interventional. I mean, it's interventional, but that has to be done at the design time. So if I just give you the facts and I don't allow you to interact with those facts, you can sometimes draw the wrong conclusions because you're looking to extract as much content as possible from the small amount of information you're getting. The next slide, please. So we dealt with that with classical statistics and a load of techniques around randomized control to stop us being manipulated in that way by data. But the new sort of evolved relationship we've had for the last 20 or so years is one where the machine has come and has this interaction with the data around us using this very, very high bandwidth and is now providing this direct interface to us. So when we look at the challenges of social media, things that have driven the Online Safety Act, I mean, some of our most important legislation in this space in the UK is almost unmentioned in the context of AI. I mean, it really is an appalling quality of conversation because the Online Safety Act is trying to deal with the sort of problems that arise when you have this control of information being fed to young, vulnerable people online. Right? An act that was lobbied heavily against by large tech companies, but is one of our few protections we've started to introduce. I'm sure it's not perfect, but it's one of the few legislative protections we started to introduce to protect our young people from this new phenomenon, that now we have this narrow bandwidth channel between us and the machine, but the machine has vast access to high quantities of data. So next slide, please. So when that's happened, so the data science, for example, is coming into that area as a new way of trying to understand those relationships. But it's not got to the formal level of understanding that we might expect for classical statistics. So data science has been the dominant domain where we've been trying to think about how to handle the downstream effects of this. And as well as the Online Safety Act, we also have the Digital Markets Competition Consumer Act, which is directly targeting the power asymmetries that arise when such information can be accumulated in one place. And you've got sort of what I think Tim O'Reilly calls algorithmic rent seeking, exploiting the competitive sort of centralization to extract large amounts of value from ownership of this information. Another phenomena that's covered in the EU by the Digital Markets Act and in the UK by the almost unreported upon Digital Markets Competition Consumer Act, which just snuck through, gained royal assent on 24th of May, just before the election, and was virtually unmentioned in the media. And one of the most critical acts we've passed to try and address these types of issues. So next slide, please. As we move on to modern systems, well, what's changed? So what I see as this new generation of generative AI, and again, it's come through the machine having access to vast quantities of our data. So what we've now got with, over the last 2 or 3 years is a technology where the machine can emulate aspects of our intelligence. And it's doing that by having read enormous quantities of our data coming from creative individuals. I'm sure, I bet 50% of the people in the room have written things that were consumed by these algorithms in an effort to try and reconstruct text. So we have contributed. It's not an intelligence that's operating in the same way as ours, but by using its capabilities to look at 300 million times more information than we can possibly look at, it's able to reconstruct aspects of our intelligence, including, and I would put this in inverted commas, an understanding of our culture. Now, I refer to this phenomena as a human analog machine, because what you're seeing is not a sort of AI in the classic 1950s sense, some sort of all-knowing, all-seeing, always correct entity. What you're seeing is an entity that has picked up enormous quantities of our data and therefore can reconstruct what a human might say in that context, and actually what a diversity of humans might say. And of course, it can also hallucinate in the way that a human might hallucinate. Now, this is an absolutely extraordinary technology. If we move to the next slide, what we can see is when we come back to our relationship between us and the machine, I used to put AI in this link here as a way of sort of thinking about the human interface with the digital computer. But if we move forward again, the way I represent this now is in the following way. So this is my rendering of a human analog machine. So it's a sort of entity that isn't a classical digital computer. It's not like programmable. It's not always correct in the way that we normally think of as computers as being always correct. But it's an entity that can represent vast quantities of information in the type of language that we would normally use for communicating with each other. And because it has access to that vast bandwidth, it has an enormously high bandwidth connection with the computer itself, with our internet and our previous waves of data. But the really interesting new communication is this narrow bandwidth channel here between us and the human analog machine. So this is a domain where there are particular dangers. So Daniel Dennett wrote an article in The Atlantic, which he talked about counterfeit humans. So the fact that we have machines that can manifest as human now, that we can't tell aren't human under certain circumstances, is, potentially very problematic. It's opening new routes for manipulation. But I want to be optimistic and focus on the positives, because it's now a bidirectional channel in the way that it wasn't before, in the way that everyone in this room can now talk to a computer and have the computer understand, in inverted commas, their intent. So that's an enormous change in society. It's a radical change in society, because across the last 50 years, as we've seen increasing use of digital technologies, those technologies have been controlled by a very small group of people, software engineers. And the situation has been akin to sort of at the development of the invention of writing, where you had a very small group of people, scribes, who could control what was written and what was read. So those people became very powerful. And over time, they gained responsibilities associated with that power. In our modern democratic institutions, those people manifest as lawyers or accountants or civil administrators. You can see all of those roles being fulfilled by scribes in the sort of Mesopotamian cities of 3000 BC. Now, the problem we face now is, as we've shifted the information topography across to the machine, the people who are controlling it have not gained the responsibilities associated with that power. And that's what's driving the current dystopia we face, that the sort of shift of societal responsibility away from democratic institutions. And when I say democratic institutions, I'm including things we don't vote for. I mean, this shouldn't need explaining, but apparently does, that the judiciary is a democratic institution, as is journalism, et cetera, et cetera. These are all the pillars of modern democracy. And these entities can be undermined when they're losing control of the information infrastructure. And we see that no more clearly than in the Horizon scandal, where you've got all the people who should have been protecting the vulnerable sub-postmasters, the lawyers, the accountants, the civil administrators, utterly disempowered, and the people who should have had the capability to understand the system, the software engineers, not having that capability. I mean, it wasn't that they were incompetent. It's the system was very complex. I mean, they weren't great, but this happens all the time, that people don't understand their own computer systems. They weren't trying to be evil. It was just a complex system that no one had control over. So move next slide. Now, my favorite description of this challenge is actually given by, next slide, Honora O'Neill with her Reith lectures in 2002, A Question of Trust. Now, Honora is talking about, at the time, the increasing processification, I don't know if that's the right word to use or that was a word she uses, of our society, where we're replacing in what she calls intelligent accountability. So accountability that is given by a professional who says it's because of this. And you can listen to these. I would listen to the lectures rather than read the book, because the book doesn't contain the questions and answers, which are very, very interesting. So the first 3 lectures she focuses on all cover this sort of issue about failing of trust. Next slide, please. So when we look at that, she talks about, for example, issues like universities being asked to treat applicants fairly on the basis of things that are quantifiable, things that are measurable. But in practice, this turns out to be quite hard to do. And then it sort of undermines the professional judgment. Not that professional judgment isn't biased, not that we don't have to worry about professional judgment, but an overemphasis on the sort of quantification sort of undermines the human side to the way we're making these judgments. And I still think that that is the most important set of Reith lectures on AI, even though they're not about AI, because that phenomenon is what we see even more pervasive as we turn over the processes to algorithmic decision-making and remove the human judgment from the system. So what do we do about it? Well, moving forward, next slide, please. One of the things we've tried to do is actually talk to the public about what they want in terms of these capabilities. And this is a public dialogue that with AI at CAM, we convened with Hopkins Van Mill in September, where we went to Liverpool and Cambridge and talked to people about what they want from this technology. And what we're seeing in practice is the technology isn't delivering for the things that they're asking for. So next slide, please. So what we see is people would like these technologies to solve problems in health, education, social care. We see that people want these technologies to enhance human decision making, not replace it. Next slide, please. But what we see in practice is that none of these solutions have been delivered. So if we go back to 2017, a previous public dialogue commissioned by the Royal Society on machine learning in society, people specifically said, please don't do human creativity. Please don't create machines that can do human creativity. That would be utterly pointless. They asked for solutions in education, healthcare, social care, security. They could see merit in all of that. They could even see merit in marketing solutions. The one thing they saw no merit in was creative AI. And the only thing we've made significant progress in since that time is, in inverted commas, creative AI. So it's great because Natasha and Jess are here, who actually sort of commissioned that report and ran that back in 2016. We're very lucky we've got such a history of policy in this country. So what's going wrong? Well, next slide, please. Well, I think that the challenge we face is around the traditional productivity flywheel. So what we tend to look at in terms of how innovation affects us in society, next slide, please, is the following cycle. So we think that R&D investment enables technological innovation that creates productivity gains, that generates economic surplus, that funds R&D investment. Now, this sort of simple idea that businesses use to try and drive forward their R&D investment, I think is failing. Next slide, please. So it relies on measurement to translate innovation into productivity. And that translation of measurement, that use of measurement to translate innovation into productivity is specifically undermining in the way that Honora O'Neill called out, right? We can't measure the intelligent accountability that humans use. The more we use process, the more we're displacing the human side. So what we tend to see is investments are focused on things that don't solve the problems people have, but things that are economically beneficial. And it turns out to be much easier to solve a set of problems people didn't know they had. So no one knew 15 years ago that it was really important to watch 30-second videos of cats, and now that problem is solved, and actually you're making a very large amount of money from solving that problem. And this is this sort of rent-seeking algorithmic economy where focusing on our attention and what we think of as an attention capture cycle is that's where the economic investment is occurring. So instead of driving forward for these things people aspire to want, what it drives forward is, yes, the things that people do want in the moment, which is, yeah, I want something that validates me, or something that's an in-group, out-group, or something that comforts me, rather than the sort of thing that will lead to a better society. And that's one of the challenges we face with our intelligence, because that aspect is within all of us. But typically our democratic institutions convene us to think higher than our personal needs. And yet those institutions themselves are undermined by this attention capture cycle. So how do we put that right? So next slide, please. The attention reinvestment cycle. So what our idea is that the AI economy is increasingly driven by attention rather than productivity. And there's this disconnect between macro interventions financially and the micro incentives we see on the ground. What we would really like is companies to provide solutions for teachers or nurses, to empower them, to re-empower them, or even lawyers, so that they could better understand when the software is failing and better intervene on their clients' behalf. But the markets in those areas aren't so large. Next slide, please. So what we see for the attention reinvestment cycle is that what we need to do is this AI, this next generation of AI, really can create time savings for professionals. So that freed attention, what we want to do is reinvest that through knowledge sharing. And then we see that could lead to organic growth through professional networks. Now, I appreciate that this sounds like a step backwards from the economics of today, where we've translated everything into money. But of course, as the years have gone by and we've overly emphasized on money as the reward system, then it causes these problems in terms of, it's not actually no longer reflecting the things we care about in society. That's natural. That's just what happens when you sort of over-optimize for a single objective. Now, stepping back and sort of starting to say, actually getting people to invest their time in sharing their knowledge, that's our way of seeing how we can propagate these ideas without having to return it to the financial incentive, which then often gets misspent. So next slide, please. So through peer-to-peer learning, we think that frontline workers can become technology champions and that we can look at sustainable, scalable implementation. Now, what I'm talking about here is a movement. Next slide, please. So that movement requires us to look again at what we're now calling the attention reinvestment cycle. So human capital should enable real-world innovation, which enables efficiency gains, which releases quality attention, which then develops human capital. So what you're looking at is cutting out the need to return that financially. Now, why this is really beautiful is actually this is relatively cheap to do, but it needs to be done at large scale. So it's actually not expensive to convene council workers together or teachers together and have them share their experience with each other and encourage them to champion the use of these technologies in their domains. It's not expensive in terms of money, but it is expensive in terms of time. Unfortunately, not all these workers have as much time as we would like, but hopefully by supporting them in deploying AI, we can release time and then have that time reinvested. So next slide, please. So in fact, I think I'll just go forward, go through the next two, because I think I'll sort of wrap up there. I think we've got the basic idea and I don't want to overrun. Next one. Yes, so, and then next one. So in conclusion, what we're looking at is trying to understand how we can build a value chain that encourages AI to serve people, science, and society, and overcome the challenge that we face at the moment, that the sort of power of this technology is vested in very few entities that are sort of algorithmic rent-seeking and extracting value from society in ways where they are not being competed with fairly, and not reinvesting that money in the areas that people in society care about the most. Now, I know each of those companies would then point to the research centers they've opened in Nairobi or the amazing work they're doing building algorithmic teachers or whatever else. And, you know, even indeed our government seems drawn in by that, but it's not working. It fundamentally is not working. And we can see that by the fact that we go back to the public dialogues of 10 years ago and we see the extremely limited progress we've made. And we see again and again when those companies attempt to step into these domains, they fail. And you can just look at their interventions in health, in education, etc., and see how badly they've gone. So we have to change that, and we have to look at how we return the value chain to focus on the things that our citizens most care about. Thank you.
I learn something every time I listen to Neil, and I talk to him a lot. So we've got plenty of time for comments and questions from all of you. Who would like to start? Right up at the top there. And I think I need to run around with the microphone. Oh, Philip is going to throw you. And just tell everybody who you are before you get going.
Do I speak into this?
You speak into it, yeah.
My name is Arshan Kurande. I'm with the Ethic AI team based in London. So really enjoyed the discussion and your thoughts. You frame this question of human talent and labor much more kind of optimistically than what we hear in the headlines, where you're focusing on this idea of reinvestment and the kind of benefit of the intangible economy that some economists have kind of articulated. The question is what role should policymaking and technical research have in propagating that more realistic view of where the future of human labor and talent lies when the headlines are filled with proud declarations of divesting from human labor and kind of reshuffling that towards AI technology?
Yeah, it's the major challenge we face, because actually one of the challenges we see in this is the limited amount of human attention means that it can easily be grabbed by simplistic narratives. And you know, that's not unique to our time. We can see that across all time. I think what's disappointing, for example, at the moment is that certainly in the UK and to some and maybe also the US, which I'm less familiar with, our policy making has utterly been captured by the wrong direction. And that's mostly circumstantial. That's mostly due to like Sunak coming in, the government needing something to build political, international political capital from. And I think we can see, even though it's been a sort of disastrous 2 years in terms of the directions we've gone in policy making, if we look at the AI Opportunities Action Plan, you can see us basically returning to what policy was 2.5 years ago. I think one of the challenges we face is that's not well understood even within the departments in the UK that are responsible, because their institutional memory is so short. So most of the people who are involved with that policy making are gone. I mean, so when you look, we've got Natasha here and Jess who have been across that policy arc. Natasha now at the Royal Academy and Jess formerly at the Royal Society, and Jess here now. So we have this large base of institutional memory, but in the UK at the moment, that's been excluded from government. So our sort of independent expertise has been removed. For again, reasons that one can go through. And in some sense, you shouldn't complain about it too much, because if that weren't the case, then we would be a technocracy. And we are not a technocracy, we're a democracy. So that's just unfortunate. But I think that my favorite sort of policy advice in this space comes from Claire Craig, who used to lead policy at the Royal Society and was Natasha's boss, who wrote a book that is How Does Government Listen to Scientists? And she builds a lot of that around the notion of the honest broker and how you convene advice through an honest broker to try and get the full diversity and spectrum of opinions. Now, unfortunately, I think if you look at the successes of that mechanism, it takes a number of years to build and deploy. What I think is worrying at the moment is in the sort of desperate need to sort of knee-jerk react with policy, we're not spending the time rebuilding that ecosystem in the UK. So from a policy perspective, I think that, we can, though, just look at the existing literature, and that's something that isn't done. So there have been some rather superficial reports, sorry, I mentioned the Tony Blair Institute, mainly from the Tony Blair Institute, that are ignoring the sort of vast literature on policy that is still valid, even in the era of generative AI. And I think it's quite easy to see through them if you go to the extra mile of digging that work out. But I think the challenge that many of the policymakers face, certainly within the UK, is with the vast increase in numbers of policymakers in this space. And that's also happened in my research field. It actually undermines the depth of understanding, because you dilute deep knowledge with incoming shallow knowledge. So one has to be extremely patient in resharing that and re-explaining the issues to people again and again. And I don't really know the answers. If I did, I would be working more in that direction. What's your thoughts? Sorry, I should say.
That's a great question. So I just visited Silicon Valley 2 weeks ago and came back, and there's just a lot of enthusiasm for where the technology is headed. There's not much thought really being given to the displacement of human labor. And there's also this feeling that policy will follow through where the technology is heading. So all that to say, it doesn't look or sound too great at this moment. And we have a new president returning in the United States, which comes with a whole other suite of considerations. But I'd like this emphasis on intangibility that you've addressed, because it does recognize that even if there's not a classical measurable way to understand human value, that it very much is there, and whether the AI space can recognize it and organize itself around that, that could be very promising.
Yeah, I think it's about tangible actions around that intentionality.
Yeah.
And that's our attempt with the attention reinvestment cycle. But I want to emphasize, it's not like we've invented something. This is what people do or have done for years. But I think its value is just difficult to quantify and has been underestimated. So maybe that's the short answer. We try and work out ways of encouraging more of that. And for example, in the UK, the Department for Education has been very good.
Who else would like to come in? In the front here. I think the idea is that you are allowed to throw this microphone at people, but I'm not sure it's worth risking.
Well, I'm not sure I'd catch it.
Information transfer.
Hi, my name's Anna Barford. I work in the Language Technology Lab, but as a social scientist, working with computer scientists. I'm just really curious about this kind of proposal for how you can create something that enables people to do better in their jobs and to not be so money focused. But I'm curious about who you think the big players would be and who the stakeholders would be that would take that agenda forwards, because you pointed out how big business was failing to do that. They're trying, but they're kind of going off in the wrong direction. So who would it be that would come in to make that happen? Would you realign business through policy, or would it be government or other actors that you see kind of really building that in a kind of tangible, practical way?
Business will never do this on their own. I think I'm very inspired by sort of Karl Popper's notion of piecemeal social engineers and about how open society survives, which is through empowering people on the ground at the coalface who are expert to deliver their best understanding of the right answer, which we know isn't always the right answer. But if you're doing that at scale, eventually I think things move in the right direction. So I think that means, and one of the things, so we can point at businesses and big tech and whatever else. And I know this is slightly dangerous because I think universities are in a terrible position. But I also think we have to admit our own failings. Isn't this our job? I mean, it has to be our job, right? Because we are the ones that are sort of responsible for monitoring society. I mean, you're a social scientist working with computer scientists. Where is the expertise if it's not in our universities? And I think one of the problems, and it's always incentive problems, we've been incentivized as universities to be targeting, the front cover of prestigious science magazines. Whereas I think we should be incentivized to, target the front cover of our local newspaper for the right reasons, not not for the wrong reasons. One of the things we're trying to do at AI CAM is, so Cambridge is supposed to be a leading university, and for me, leadership implies showing the way forward and enabling others to follow. So that's very much what we're trying to do with AI CAM. In the past, when I was at Sheffield, we had less freedom to do that, because if we went ahead and did that, people would say, well, you're not, you should be trying to get Nobel Prizes. That's what everyone's trying to do. And we're looking back in the past to see other times when this happened. And there's a really nice example that Jess and I have been working on, where when you look at the Great Exhibition in the 1850s, there was a royal commission launched to sort of investigate why Cambridge and Oxford had delivered so little in terms of practical outcomes of the Great Exhibition. Not the story we normally tell. We like to go on about Newton. It's triggered the launch of the Natural Sciences Tripos, and later triggered the arrival of Maxwell to launch the Cavendish Laboratory. And taking this sort of very seriously, because what was going on is across the rest of the country, you had these non-conformist colleges, the Homerton College is an example of when it was in London. Manchester Harris College was at one point not in Oxford, was up in Manchester, and before that in Warrington. These educational entities associated with the non-conformists were the ones that were delivering the innovation that was needed on the ground for their localities. And I think you could argue that today our whole university system, through misaligned incentives from government, has lost that contact that those civic universities, they later became civic universities, some of these entities, were founded to deliver, and that they haven't been delivered. Okay, we can go through the politics of this. We can look at what's happened in the UK and how we've been undermined in delivering on this. But the fact is, I don't think we're doing our job. So businesses will never do this on their own. But we can convene, and we can't do this on our own. But we can convene these conversations across public sector, business, third sector, and everything, and encourage it. We can't deliver it fully, but we need to build the body of people that will deliver it. What we're thinking of as community advocates, we need to take the council worker that's doing planning systems with AI, which is happening in Cambridge, and give them the confidence to realise that they need to teach that to the council worker in Rotherham. We can't go and do that on their behalf.
There was Natasha in the middle. Yeah, get ready to catch.
In America, definitely just grow.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much, Neil. I'm Natasha McCarthy. I'm from the Royal Academy of Engineering. And I sort of made the point that you made today a couple of times about the fact that the brilliant dialogue that Jess led at the Royal Society highlighted the fact that people were least interested in AI doing creative jobs, more interested in solving complex problems. But one of the things I see in conversations around AI over and over again that surprises me is the focus on time. This will save time. It will save time. It will save your business time. And in some cases, that's super important. So I hear public say, I would like time to be saved in the process between having a scan and getting my scan result at hospital. That's meaningful saving of time. But a lot of the examples feel like saving time is an end in itself. And I'm interested in your talk sort of pointing out that kind of speed of information processing as the differentiator between the human and the AI. And do you think that is why there's such a massive focus on time, or is it purely kind of the business interest? And is there anything that could shift a focus onto benefits of AI that are not just about saving time, but about doing things we just can't do at all?
I'll pass to Diane to answer this in terms of how we measure things and how time plays a role. I agree it can be used very superficially, but before I pass to Diane, I guess here I'm saying it's going around the cycle, but in some sense it's never been quantified in my version, right? It's just you have somebody say, oh, that's great that you now can do this thing, you know, and this with the planning one, the sort of things we're hearing is going down like from 14-person months to like 2-person weeks. And I mean, we've already had this conversation with the council before the last, with leaders of the council before the last event we did, because their instinct is then to say, that's great, now we can push ahead. And it's like, no, can you please give back? And that's the hard bit, I think, actually. So, of course, they may be calculating it in those terms, but what we're trying to sort of do, and I think that this is the bit that requires effort to get over this bump, which is say, now that you've had this time released, I mean, one of the consequences of what Prof Neil was talking about is we, in the name of efficiency, we've undermined professional judgment and reduced the amount of time professionals have to think about these sort of things. But there is a window of opportunity to get that time back and reinvest it for themselves in their other areas. But I want to pass to Diane to say maybe a bit about, because her measure of progress talks a lot about this.
So I've got my own mic. I'm quite interested in using time as an alternative productivity metric to get away from the focus on money. And part of it is about saving time, but as Neil said, part of it is also about liberating quality time. And so if you think about the healthcare examples, as you say, it would be speeding up test results, but that should liberate time for health professionals to spend more of their time interacting with patients and delivering quality care. But as your question alludes to, the productivity story isn't just about doing the same things, it's about doing things completely differently. And there I think the economics discipline needs to step up. We tend to focus at the moment on productive activity as tasks. So you divide the job up into tasks and they're getting rearranged. But it's the way that they're combined together and what they are combined to do that really is going to deliver productivity for society. And that bit of process re-engineering, if you like, is the next step for economics, I think.
Thank you.
But thank you for plugging my book, Neil. Yeah. Throw it at him, yes.
Small. Thank you very much. That was really, really fascinating. My question, I suppose, is going back to your point about time constants at the beginning. So displacement of, so AI is already out there, it's already changing the economy, it's already on its journey. There's huge amounts of funding behind it, huge concentration in the companies that are driving the direction. In my limited experience, policy and regulation to make changes to shift from one framework to another is very, very slow. So there's a question about time constants here, really. So, and regulation and policy require evidence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So to move towards the framework that you're describing, how do you think that is going to compare to the speed at which AI actually hits and adjusts the economy and all the changes that get made already? So is it going to be a retrospective thing, or do you think this is realistically something that can be done proactively?
It's a great question. So when I think about time constants, I often think about football. So if you think about early versions of the game of football, including these village games, it was people running around chasing the ball. But if you look at the modern game, people move to where the ball's going to go. And when you look at what UK AI policy was 3 years ago, and given that it's just been reset to be exactly that, it had dictated we need to move to where the ball's going to go. So we asked the Intellectual Property Office to do an investigation, and unfortunately they said we're not going to do it. So we had all those foundations. So when when policy is playing confidently and isn't in this spotlight and feeling this need to run around screaming, which is a need that is being driven by the sort of promises of the sort of Silicon Valley techno solutionists. It plays extremely well, but what happens is there's this sort of disruption that causes everyone to chase the ball, and that's disastrous because it moves us away from the areas that we know. And the great thing in policy is like, what are the problems in policy? education, healthcare, social care. Before I took over interim chairing of the Centre of Data Ethics and Innovation, in order to try and get on top of all the names of civil servants in the UK government, I watched the first series of Yes Minister. It's like, oh, that's the Sir Humphrey and that's the Bernard and etc. And every single episode is about a live issue today. Even there's one about data and privacy, and this is filmed in the 1980s. So these are the wicked problems, the 40-year-old problems. They're not going away. And the problem is we've got sort of breathless policymakers running around saying, we're going to solve it all with AI, or the Tony Blair Institute saying that. No, we're not. We're going to have the same challenges as before, where we need deployed experts at the coalface to use their expertise as well as possible to try and address these problems. And we need to empower them. Now, they won't all exist in the same form, but we can't predict what form that's going to look like. So a lot of it is about, calming down and having confidence at the tiller, as it was, and having a sort of keel of understanding that allows us to sort of go in the same direction, even when the sort of media wind is flapping about. But I accept that that's, it's difficult for governments to do when it's the subject of strong political focus. Now, ironically, those, Trump has distracted everyone from that, and now there is an opportunity to perhaps get back to doing serious policy rather than playing to the front pages in this space. But on the time constants, I think one of the things that we sometimes forget is that the deployment of these technologies, and Bill Gates certainly uses the quote, but it's very often we overestimate what's going to happen in the next couple of years and underestimate what's going to happen in a decade. And that process is what means that we're failing to catch the things that are going on in a decade. We were asking for gaps and overlaps analysis on UK regulation. Again, I look at Natasha and Jess, coming out of the Royal Society of British Academy report that I think is, what year is that, 2016? That was needed. That our current policy on regulation in the UK is actually set in that report coming up for a decade ago. And yet government still has not done a gaps and overlaps analysis around what regulations apply and where they apply and where we need reinforcement and where we need clarity in terms of separating the regulators. This is basic and simple stuff. It's just not the sort of stuff that gets you front page headlines or the minister wants to announce. So it's unfortunately, and of course another challenge we face is the reorganisation of departments within the UK. But the fundamental work that policymakers do is still valid, right? It hasn't gone away, it will shift. It can be improved by judicious use of these technologies. But the problem we face is when we lose sight of that and start chasing to the ball. Play the position as it stands. The game will evolve and we'll watch that evolution and change in response to the way the game evolves. But stop chasing the ball.
Policy is running around shouting, happening in a lot of domains at the moment, I think. Steve in the middle.
Steve Unger. My background was originally Ofcom, telecoms regulation. Currently doing quite a lot of work in DSIT. I think we're one of the small minority of people not working on AI policy, but I observe a lot of people scurrying around. I'm curious, what do you think they really ought to be doing? What can they positively do to make a difference?
Actually, it would be great if the team was, I think, reduced by 75%. So there were fewer of them, so they stopped interacting with each other all the time, coming up with fantasy ideas about what the technology looks like, and were forced to look outwards more. I don't know if the numbers are right. Michelle Donnellan announced, so the Office for AI, which led to our AI white paper, I think was maximum of 20 people. And Michelle Donnellan announced there were going to be 200 people working at DSIT. Now, if you work in any large organization, scaling a team from 20 to 200 is extremely difficult to do and maintain competence. And so what we can see is, I'm not saying everyone's incompetent, but that systemically, they will have lost institutional competence. So I don't quite know how I would manage if I was sort of in the position of, no one's going to be allowed to just cut the team by 3/4, ironically, despite the fact that they want to cut civil servant things, because it would get bad headlines. So, these were one-way doors that were bad decisions. But how you sort of address that, I do think it's about grounding what you're doing. And a lot of what I think needs shifting is to stop talking about the technology and talk more about the deployment of the technology. And that also happens more if you're engaged in actual government deployments. One of the things we do a lot at AI CAM is sort of work with people, give them small amounts of funding to sort of deploy the technology themselves. For example, in our local government's work, one of the things that was an eye-opener to me is that when local governments go out and contract out work to companies to support them, they very often, after 5 years of contract is up, they want to move contract, they suddenly find that they don't have access to the API. So what does that mean? They don't have the programmatic access they need to get their own data out of the computer system. We just saw that with the Horizon scandal. So something like a 600 million cost for the post office in order to get access to their own data in the Horizon system, because they didn't have a contract that allows them to have access for their own data. I actually think that's quite easily dealt with law change. So the government's looking at smart data now as a sort of like right of access to data. Well, maybe as part of that legislation, and I keep meaning to email them to mention this, I mustn't forget, that we should be looking at prohibiting that if you buy in a service from an external provider, that external provider isn't allowed to run that service with data that is critical to your business and then charge you for access to that data. So it's some version of the GDPR for businesses. Like, it doesn't work for individuals, because as individuals we have right of access to our data, but businesses don't have right of access to their data. So there are sort of tangible things we could do, but they all emerge from being much more closely involved with real problems. I think the problem we have at the moment, and that's always the problem with a centralized organization, is lots of people who are disconnected from the real problems, talking about problems they see on Twitter. And those are, as far removed from the problems on the ground as anything. And the way you solve that is you get those people engaged with the challenges people are facing at the coalface. But that, first of all, involves instilling them in a much greater respect for those issues. Again, we see that with the Horizon program. Where things go wrong is the failure to respect what the sub-postmasters are saying. Or the Lorenzo program, the national program for IT, the failure to respect what the doctors and the 10 billion loss of money, the failure to respect what the doctors, the hospital administrators were saying, the failure to visit hospitals and see how the system is failing. So I think that I would probably go for that. We've got enough people that we could dispatch them out to the coalface and have them learn a little bit more of what's going on the ground.
So we've got a question from online which demands a long answer, but you're going to have to give it a short answer, Neil, so we can have coffee.
Probably they're questions that deserve a short answer. I give a long answer. So this is good.
How do you assess the EU AI Act as a framework to build on?
I must admit, I didn't reread it after the first draft, which was so appalling and so mismanaged, because it tried to make a definition of what AI was. It did exactly the wrong thing. Exactly what all the policy work we've done in the UK say don't do. It tried to regulate the technology rather than its deployment. Now, I know over time they shifted to a risk-based framework, but it was very rushed, and there was an atmosphere of, it's just the wrong way of doing it, right? Trying to be the first to legislate is just the wrong goal. And it was clear, because of EU elections coming up, they wanted to be the first to legislate, and they wanted to have that out before the elections. I paid little attention to it because I think it's like focusing too much on it. I admit businesses obviously have to be very aware of it, etc. But from a policy perspective, it feels too much like chasing the ball. It's so poorly conceived, it won't be realized in that form, I believe. And actually, a much more interesting regulation is the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services, DSA as well, and in the UK, the Digital Markets Competition and Consumer Act. These are much more interesting pieces of legislation that actually attack the foundations of the algorithmic rent seeking and should lead to more competitive markets around data and therefore AI. Because every sort of challenge we face with data is also a challenge with AI. So they've been well thought through. I'm sure they're not perfect. There is no perfect legislation. I'm sure there'll be problems, but these are the interesting pieces of legislation. But I have to say, I'm not deeply expert on the AI Act anymore. Only sort of, it just was so exasperatingly formed that I must say sometimes you just have to sort of look away from the car crash and try and pretend something else.
On that mildly provocative note, please join me in thanking Neil, and we'll go for coffee.